Okay. Welcome back from lunch. My name is Mark Taylor. I'm a researcher at the Fafo Institute here in Oslo, and I'll be chairing this session, which is a continuation of the session from before lunch on sustainable investors. I'm just going to hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Anita Halvorssen, who over lunch mentioned that she's back at her alma mater at the University of Oslo, where she started. But she finished her PhD at Columbia. So welcome back, Anita, and the floor is yours.
Where's the... This is a presentation regarding the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, or the Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global. And investing in sustainability is the name of this paper I wrote together with Cody Eldredge, who's a political scientist, PhD candidate at the University of Colorado. And he did the empirical piece and looked at how the fund, the ethics guidelines, are actually working and having a positive effect and getting some companies to get on board with sustainable development. I have some slides here. I'm not sure how many of you know about the Norwegian Oil Fund. Any show of hands? So most people have heard. And how many of you know about the system with the ethics guidelines and all of that? Most of the people. Okay, so then I can really save time. That's wonderful. I get more to the reform part. We all know this, but this is what I'm setting out, the reform at the end. And we all know this. You've seen a million times. So regarding sovereign wealth funds, I'm not sure how many Norwegians are actually aware that our pension fund is what the rest of the world calls sovereign wealth fund. And this is huge in my mind, because sovereign wealth funds now, they're investing, we're talking trillions of dollars. And the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, as of a couple of days ago, was over $800 billion, so getting close to $1 trillion just for the one fund. It's the largest fund in the world. So as far as sustainable development goes, if they've got something good, I think that can be a help in our area, and pushing companies to do the right thing. And as in the Brundtland Commission report, elevating sustainable development to a global ethic, because you have a lot of sovereign wealth funds out there, Middle Eastern oil countries that sustainable development, I don't think that's part of the regular vocabulary. And then we have these principles we've already talked about, so ESG is the focus, and the UN Global Compact, and then the OECD guidelines that we've also talked about. So that's great. And the materiality we've talked about earlier today, but we're maximizing long-range investment returns. And then looking at the Norwegian one, just a couple of things. So it's unique compared to most, because most sovereign wealth funds, there are different numbers, but they're like 68 or more, depending upon which measurements you use to count and what is a sovereign wealth fund. In a lot of the ways they set it out, they say the US has one too. Can anybody think of which one that might be? Alaska has a sovereign wealth fund because of the oil. And the Norwegian one has actually been called the gold standard. And the special part about the way it was set up was that it was setting it up for sound investment contingent on sustainable development, and you don't see that in most of the sovereign wealth funds. New Zealand has one that's got a lot of good things. And then you have the pension funds. In Europe, you have several pension funds, and a lot of them, or more of them, are focusing on sustainable development, of course. So it's a good model. Now, being the largest, I think that comes with the responsibility, but the other side is that Norway's gotten a lot of good press for this, and it's an icon, the ethics guidelines, so I think it's really important to carry on and I'll get back to that shortly when I talk about the reform proposals. So it was already in 1991 the fund was established, but the actual ethics guidelines didn't come in play until 2004. There was earlier part where it was focusing on international obligations, international law obligations that started in 2001, but then the ethics guidelines took over. And then we are looking at how it's set up. So it's an account at the central bank, and only 4%, I mean, it's give or take, it depends upon the situation. So in the recession, there was more money going into the annual budget, but this is the idea, is that you weren't going to flood the economy with the oil money, because that would make a mess. And it's a question of long-term, because there are no pension obligations every year like a lot of the other pension funds out there. But they did change the name, as you saw, in 2006 to pension fund instead of oil fund or petroleum fund, depending upon if you're speaking English or Norwegian. It's used all sorts. But then when you talk about long-term, that's the one that's almost a privileged position when you don't have to give out pensions hand out the pensions every year. Then you have a whole other arrangement than most. There isn't that pressure, of course, so you have more leeway. But it's a benchmark system, so obviously they're looking for a return. And we're talking about a lot of companies, so how does one possibly look and see about sustainable development? We're talking over 7,000 companies. And it's invested only abroad and all over the place, and there was now been more focus on environmental and going into developing countries also. And then the distribution of the roles of the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. So the Ministry of Finance determining the strategy and then being the final decision maker on exclusion observation after the Ethics Council comes with its recommendation, and then following up operational management, and then reporting to the Storting. And the other part is that when they set this up, it was based on the outlook that Norwegians want to be able to sleep at night. And I am a Norwegian, so I feel this is interesting, because Norwegians want to sleep well at night knowing that the money they're investing is not being used to commit human rights abuses or egregious environmental harm. So that was kind of the starting point. And so it is connected with the Parliament, with these reports, and the ethics guidelines actually came out from the Graver Commission that was focused on what the values were, and then looking at these international, like I talked about the OECD and so forth, the guidelines. Implementing the strategy in the bank, and then in the bank, like I said, it's an account, but then you have the investment management. So NBIM is that arm that specifically deals with the sovereign wealth fund. And active investor, controlling the risk, and then exercising the ownership rights. And that's where it comes in with what they do as far as sustainable development goes. Because then the third leg under the Ministry of Finance is also the Ethics Council that then is giving the recommendations to the Ministry of Finance. So we're looking at sound financial returns. It's also written later as maximizing financial return, but then you're still looking at being under the condition of sustainable development. The mechanism then exercising ownership rights in NBIM, so that's in the bank, and then observation exclusion, which is the Ethics Council coming with recommendations to the ministry. So negative screening is how they used it before. Now they talk about exclusion, and the one is products-based and the other one is behavior-based or conduct-based. So it wouldn't be an acceptable risk that the fund is or willing or complicit in grossly unethical activities. That's how it was written up. And then it came out with a new, a little bit amended with what are the requirements as far as the different products-based and conduct-based, and there was a little bit more emphasis on how you determined this, and that's written up, and you guys can look it up. It's in the paper also. And then the POSCO case showing how the national contact point then had, there was brought a complaint, and they determined that NBIM was indeed in breach of the OECD guidelines due to human rights abuses in the company the fund invested in, the South Korean company that was displacing 22,000 people in India. And that was just last spring, and that got a lot of press, and that brings me to the next part. When you see what we looked at, the empirical, on the exclusion side is where we looked, because they had the most, the data that's transparent. The Ethics Council writes up all their recommendations, very transparent, and then the Ministry of Finance decides after that. Now, there was set out a strategy council to look and review the sustainable investment, the responsible investment for the fund. And they suggested more transparency and to look at the purpose and the goal. And then as a result of that, they said it made sense for the Ethics Council to be integrated into the bank. In my mind, that is a mistake. I don't think it should be integrated into the bank. And the reason being because it has gotten a very good renommé, the Ethics Council, because their opinions are well reasoned and it's transparent. That's the huge part. In the bank, there's a lot less transparency, and the way they have been doing their bit, which is hard to find out how because it's not transparent, has been not a big success, because they were just 2 days ago, the UN Committee on Social and Cultural Rights actually said that they had to be more focused on human rights in their investments. So I think the Ethics Council should remain, and we can always tighten up and make it a little bit stronger. On the Ethics Council, they can perhaps make some changes, but the transparency, you can't say anything about that. It's transparent the way it is, but maybe that they get a little bit more power to have the first decisions, the straightforward decisions, and then the difficult ones, then the ministry makes the final decision, and one then has the opportunity to change its mind. The ministry can say up or down, but not take a year and a half to decide a case when the Ethics Council has already come out with their recommendation, because then the data is old, and the Strategy Council said that that's not good. But I think it's really important to keep it separate, and I think it'll disappear. As we talked about earlier, transparency and disclosure is really important. And we might not see that anymore if it goes into the bank. Then the bank is not known for transparency because that's not their job. So I think it's very difficult if that were to be the case. So we'll see what happens, because there will be a white paper in the spring on this, on what the ministries, what they're thinking about it. Thank you very much. That was it.